And all these contractors came in. These guys, Crowder Gulf, they had been instrumental in helping us to make a comeback after Hurricanes Ivan and Katrina. And they just retrofitted, and now they're oil spill disaster relief guys, and they come out and did everything from haul workers from site to site to haul debris away from the site. Here are some typical workers picking up seashells out on the beach at Gulf Shores, Alabama. And here's a lineup of workers ready to go out at Pensacola Beach. So huge manpower. At the peak of the cleanup, there were over 7,000 boats out in the Gulf. When I walked out on the beach and looked out at this armada of everything from tankers to Coast Guard cutters to shrimpers to little tiny skiffs, it looked like we were at war out there, and we were. It was just a different kind of war. 47,000 individuals, personnel, were involved in the cleanup. So 47,000 people were employed working to help it. About 700 miles of coastline were directly affected by the oil. And when the workers started cleaning the beaches, we had never done this before. So we were learning as we went. It was a very fast learning curve. And they started out using sandbox shovels, like little kids play with in the sandbox. And it was so odd for me to see these full-grown men out there with these little buckets and shovels. Finally, they graduated to those nets, like you dip fish out of the aquarium with, the little green nets, because they found that the sand could fall through. And eventually, they went to often just getting it with their hands. So this worker is out there in the heat of June, 100-degree day, picking up oil from the sand with his bare hands. Well, by the end of June, they realized that it was too hot for any person to be out there. So they switched to night shifts. It was 100 degrees during the day, maybe 80 degrees at night. Plus, I mentioned that the oil was liquefying during the day and making it too difficult to clean up. So they started getting out there at night with these bright lights, and the crews would work these 6- and 8-hour shifts at night. And unfortunately, that's when the big female sea turtles come in to lay their eggs. So they had to hire monitors who sat on ATVs and watched the spill workers, and if a big female came up and hauled out and started walking across the sand, everything was shut down, the lights were shut off, everybody went home. While the female was monitored, we watched one female completely oiled come up on the beach, turn around, dig a pit with her hind flippers, lay her 100 and so eggs, cover it back up, head back to the Gulf, and then the wildlife rehabbers caught her and cleaned her with the dish detergent and got her at least where she was breathing properly, and then they let her go back into the Gulf. There were not enough facilities to bring those animals in. So nighttime was cooler, but it complicated things as well. And because it was so hot, it was 20 minutes working, 20 minutes sitting back in the tent with the fans running, drinking water, and then 20 minutes working, and then 20 minutes back in the fan getting cooled down. So very inefficient way to work. And the workers were recruited from the unemployment lines. So during the economic recession, they just went inland to these small towns where folks were standing in line at the unemployment offices, and they loaded them up and they brought them down to the coast and paid them between $13 and $35 an hour to clean up the beaches. Here's a front end loader carrying the clear bags filled with the oiled sand, oiled seashells, oiled debris. Here are the sifters that sifted the sand, and I will pass around a sample of sand from Orange Beach, Alabama 1 month before the spill. And then I'm going to pass around what the sand looks like now. And you can take a look at it and decide for yourself. What the sifters did was they got all the large globs of oil, but they definitely didn't get the little stuff. So it fell down into the sand, became part of the sand, and then as the wind blew new sand onto the beach, that oil solidified and formed what we call oil asphalt, which was a flat layer of hardened oil they then had to come back in and use jackhammers to break up those long, flat slabs of hardened crude oil. And then someone invented the sand shark. And that was a big machine that was very expensive. There were only 6 of them, so you had to share them and move them from community to community. And it would come in and take the small bits of oil that were mixed in with the sand and sift it even finer and get those little bits of oil out. So things are actually looking better. This is Little Lagoon, which is the only open pass between Mobile Bay and Perdido Bay in Alabama. And it's kept open. It's a natural pass, but it was closed off by Hurricane Camille in 1969 and is now physically kept open with seawalls. They did not want the oil to come into Little Lagoon, so they used a giant sand wall to block it off. This works a lot better than those booms. And this sand wall is still in place right now. So they have the booms off beyond it too, but the sand wall, they wanted to be very sure that no oil got into Little Lagoon. It's a critical estuary, nursery area for shrimp and crabs and mullet and many other species. Well, what has happened, it worked great, but now that flushing is not available, so there's no exchange between the fresh water and salt water there in the lagoon, and things are starting to stagnate and die. So on February 1st, they're knocking that sand wall out. The beaches were cleaned beautifully. By August 1st, tourists were starting to come back. The restaurants were starting to open and at least serve chicken and steak. And then a big storm, not a hurricane, but a storm came in and delivered a new load of oil. And you know, people said, well, we don't see it out there. It doesn't look like it's thick. But it had all sunk to the bottom of the Gulf. And in some places it's about 2 inches thick, and in some places it's 2 feet deep of oil stagnating, hanging out on the bottom, waiting for the next storm to bring it in. Here are some hermit crabs crawling across oiled beach. And I don't know that folks clean too many hermit crabs, but they were definitely affected. This is a white blanket of fish, and we saw this in a number of back bayous and bays. As the oil came in, covered the surface, and started to permeate the water column, the oxygen levels dropped 4 times lower than normal. So when we did water quality testing on Dauphin Island and at Fort Morgan, Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, Perdido Pass, and Pensacola Beach, and in nowhere was the oxygen level any higher. So it pushed the fish up into new areas where they could survive, and the dolphins followed them, and then the dolphins began to die. And this was one that we saw on Horn Island, completely oiled. This is an oiled juvenile that was on Pensacola Beach. And we expected a lot more dolphins than we actually found, and there have been some speculations on this. One is that dolphins are very intelligent and mobile. So when they started seeing the oil, we saw dolphins coming up through oil sheen, breathing through it, you know, at the surface with their young. But we think that they moved out of the area intentionally. And also, when a dolphin dies, if you don't find it floating on the surface, then it's going to sink to the bottom and deteriorate or be eaten by sharks. So for every 1 dolphin that washed up dead on the beach, there are probably 10 out there in the Gulf. But we were still impressed with the lower number compared to some of the other species, and relieved. Right now there are 1 dolphin in a rehab facility in Gulfport, Mississippi, still getting healthy. That's it. All the others have been released and are on their own. But they built all these tanks very quickly to try to accommodate what they thought were going to be lots and lots of dolphins coming in, and it just didn't happen. The birds is a different story. 1,000, almost 2,000 birds recovered alive, and about 900 of those were released. And about 4,500 bird deaths attributed to the oil spill. And most of these birds, if you think about it, are diving birds, birds that are going to go down into the oil to fish, birds that are floating on the surface out there, and shorebirds when the oil comes up close to the edge. So, for example, people ask me how the hummingbirds were doing. And yes, they migrated through both in the spring and the fall, but they stop and nectar up, rest along the shore, and then take off across the Gulf of Mexico to Costa Rica or Nicaragua, and they might use all those 700 boats as resting platforms that they would appreciate as they make their way across the Gulf, but not affected by the oil on the surface. Some of the birds that were most affected were the brown pelicans, and the state bird of Louisiana, it had just been taken off the list. It was just making a great comeback. And what happened was the adults would go out and try to feed or get fish for their young, come back and sit on the nest and oil the eggs, or get oil all over their young. So it affected not just the birds that were physically touching the oil, but all of the birds. And here's a bird, unidentified species, mired in crude oil along the coast of Louisiana. When this happens, even if the bird just gets a little bit of oil on it, it preens its feathers so much that it ends up spreading that oil over its entire body. It also, as it's preening, ingests the oil and causes liquid pneumonia or some other toxicity to its body. So even if the bird looks pretty good, maybe just has a little oil around its face or wings, it's going to continue to deteriorate. In the north, the northern gannets took a real hit because they're offshore, because they hang out in the area of the direct oil spill, and because they spend so much of their lives out there on the surface of the Gulf. Hundreds of gannets. And then, of course, the brown pelicans. Here's a brown pelican as it struggles to lift up off of the water. And here's a brown pelican that has resigned itself to not leaving the water. And I decided that this photo should be posted on the door of every executive of the oil companies that work out there in the Gulf of Mexico. Here's PJ, who single-handed, with a team of about 6 of his staff, rescued about 300 brown pelicans between June 1st and July 15th. So he's definitely a hero. And then once those brown pelicans are brought in, they have to be thoroughly cleaned with the Dawn dish detergent, fed to build up their strength. You have to make sure that they're able to fly, so you exercise them in these big pens that are in like airplane hangars or warehouses. And then even then, do you re-release them back into the same area, knowing that they're going to go right back out there and do it again? Well, because of space constraints, they weren't able to hold the birds, and the birds don't like to be held, especially the adult pelicans, for any period of time. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came up with the scheme to re-release the healthy birds in the Tampa area. Still on the Gulf of Mexico. They're a Gulf of Mexico species, so they were still on the Gulf. They dropped down far enough south to an area that they didn't think would be affected by the oil spill, and that proved to be true. And they released the birds there. So as of right now, 290 brown pelicans have been released in the Tampa Bay area. What's not known, all of the birds were banded with a brightly colored band that can be seen from a distance. We don't know if they'll stay in Tampa and find feeding grounds and roosting and nesting sites there on top of an existing brown pelican population, or if they'll try to return, and there's a very strong instinct to return to the breeding grounds where they're from. We don't know that yet. We'll know in April. Here's the very first sea turtle victim of the oil spill. He was brought into New Orleans and had all the oil cleaned out of his mouth and throat, and was held there and then released before it got cold. so like early October.